Hi, I'm Zach Childs, and welcome to the Truetone Lounge. Today, our guest is John Leventhal, Grammy Award-winning Americana Association Instrumentalist of the Year, songwriter of
Americana
note.
sociopath, I thought you were going to say.
Yes. Well, welcome.
Thanks, man. Great to be here.
Well, thank you. Well, what are some of your earliest musical memories?
Oh, God. For better or worse, I do know the first record I bought. It was Battle of New Orleans by Johnny Horton. That was the first record that imprinted me. Still think it's a pretty great record.
Yeah.
And then, of course, later I discovered it's Grady Martin and Harold Bradley and all those great players. But I think like a lot of guys my age, the Beatles are basically ground zero.
Okay.
Sort of the big bang.
And that's what caused you to actually pick up the guitar?
It did, yeah. Well, it caused me to pay attention to music and to feel mysteriously moved by music, at however old I was when they hit 12 or 13. And, that stays with you. I mean, my theory is kind of the music that really gets to you first in that kind of mysterious way where you get that record that you've got to hear every day before you go to school. Mm-hmm. Or, it just sort of busts open your little 12 or 13-year-old heart in a way. In some ways, as we get older, I still think that remains a template and a foundation for what you like or what you're trying to do. Like in some ways, I suppose, even though I've had to consciously jettison a lot of my Beatle influences because in my early productions, I thought I was using them too much. I mean, I still think I'm trying to get back at trying to make my own versions of the records that move me. I'm trying to create the feelings in myself that first got to me when I'm 13. This is kind of esoteric, but I do actually think it's true. I think that template of the music you love from like 12 to 18 in particular never leaves you. And it sort of leads you on your musical path in some ways. Not that you can't learn a lot of other stuff, but the mystery and the feeling of it, like sort of the pre-analytical part of the music, stays with you. Like sometimes I don't really want to know. Like I'm pretty smart musically, and I have a pretty wide sense of harmony and stuff, and good at hearing even complex chords. But sometimes I don't really want to know what's going on because I love the mystery of it. I do. I love sort of just love it. So the Beatles, anyway. There's a long-winded way to say the Beatles.
Was there a specific Beatle album?
Well, I mean, they hit me hot and heavy right from the beginning, but I suppose the album I have mentioned before that really sort of got me was Beatles 65. And that's kind of when they kind of slightly introduced that country and folk thing. Yeah. Like George is starting to play kind of some twangy stuff on I'm a Loser, and Babies in Black is on that record, and I'll Be Back. So there are these really kind of longing, haunting, like musically they started to get, they're just stepping away slightly from the 2.5-minute pop song into these darker things, undoubtedly influenced by Dylan and stuff.
Right.
But still, that record was huge for me. I mean, that was the record, that was the album. Like I had listened to it every day of my life, I'm sure, when I was 13 or 14, I still love it. It still comes on, I still love it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was your first guitar?
Well, I'm a little bit of a late bloomer. A little unusual that way. So my first real guitar I got my senior year of high school. I bought a Gibson J50, like with the ceramic bridge, super narrow neck. And I didn't even own an electric guitar. Mm-hmm. I would occasionally play one. My buddy Robbie had one. And I loved music, but I didn't, where I grew up, there wasn't much of a template for becoming a musician, particularly a pop musician. There were some, I grew up like 20 miles north of Manhattan. So there were some musicians in town, but they had tended to be like, the first call cellist in the NBC orchestra and that kind of thing. There were no jazz or rock or pop musicians. My family wasn't that musical. Well, my mom had a certain, in retrospect, she had a certain kind of love of music that I think wore off on me. I bought my first electric guitar my senior year of college, faced with like the prospect of like a real job or going to law school or something that would have been like, would have made me a miserable old man. I decided to take a year off and I bought like a mid-60s ES 335. I knew nothing about electric guitars. Like I didn't know a Telecaster from a Strat. All I did is I kind of saw like that shape probably on a B.B. King cover or something. I thought, oh, that's the cool guitar to get. And I bought like a mid-60s 335 for $150 off like some kind of back of the newspaper thing. I went to college in Madison, Wisconsin and bought it. And it was fun for a while. And then I was like, well, why don't I sound like all these other guys? And then eventually, pretty quickly in succession, I kind of dialed in James Burton, and there were lots of other guitar players I loved too. This would sort of be around 1970. I dialed in James Burton, I dialed in Ry Cooder, I loved Jesse Ed Davis and Curtis Mayfield. I mean, in a really short period of time, a lot of guitar. All of a sudden, I started thinking like a guitar player. So the 335 was the first one, the first electric guitar I got, and then somebody stole my J50. Somewhere along the line. And then I didn't own an acoustic guitar for a long time till I actually met Shawn Colvin. And I sold my 335. I owned a this Telly, and a Strat, mid-60s Strat. Those are the only two guitars I owned. And when I needed an acoustic guitar, I would borrow hers. Yeah, I'm definitely a late bloomer, I would have to say.
So take us from, from college to Shawn Colvin. What's happening in that period of time?
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, that's like a 10-year period. So I got out of college and decided to take a year off. So I went with some friends to Colorado Springs to be in a band. And we did have a band.
There were substances also during that time in Colorado.
I think we did a fair number of dumb things. It was actually a great time. I think my passion for music and guitar playing was, I was starting to get the bug. And, I think I was starting to listen more critically. And I also kind of, from a very early age, the songwriting thing was in me, like right away. It wasn't just, it's hard to explain. I didn't live in Nashville and I hadn't quite gotten to Manhattan yet. So I think I was just beginning to dial in the session thing, like, oh, you could play on records to make a living. Like, I didn't even really know. I tried to be in this band and I was writing songs and maybe I was trying to pitch the song somehow, but it was all on a real kind of Bush League level. And then at some point I just had an epiphany, like, what am I doing here? And if I'm going to really do this, I should be in New York, and I moved back to New York and I got really lucky. I moved back to New York and I got a gig in a band that worked all the time so I could make my living playing guitar. And the band leader happened to be great. And another musician in the band was a deep musician. And I was the kid in the band. They were all older guys. And it was this guy, his name was Billy Vera, who's actually still around. He lives in LA.
Yes.
And we played in bars and clubs all in the New York area. And we played predominantly, not for people to listen, but for people to dance. And it was my schooling. It was sort of taught me how to be in a band. It taught me how to play and what not to play and when to shut up and when I needed to shine and get a sense of the dynamic and the flow and how to back him up. And Billy pulled from everything. I mean, a lot of like classic R&B and soul from 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. We played Al Green tunes. We also played Haggard tunes. We played all this stuff. So, and that was like 2 or 3 years. And that was really it. Now, the bass player in the band was this guy, Tommy Woke, who then went on to become T-Bone Woke.
T-Bone.
Who was on, Hall & Oates and stuff. And,
Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, and Tommy was a deeply musical guy. And I kept going, this band sounds great. And I kind of intuitively knew it wasn't because of me. And I started to realize, it's the bass player, it's him. And then I realized, and then immediately I wanted to play bass, and I started playing bass. So pretty early on, I was playing bass too. And but it was the stance that from an early stage, I loved guitar and I wanted to be a guitar player, but I also was thinking about everything else at the same time. Like a lot of guitar players, I suspect, get very hung up in the guitar, or bass player, or drummer, right? They get hung up and sort of focused on their shit and their instrument. But from a very early thing, probably because I wanted to write songs too, I was focused on the guitar as part of a musical ensemble. So the thrust was, how do you be musical? How do you make the whole thing work? How do you create feeling? How do you make the thing surge? Or how do you make the thing pull back? I was always interested in the whole thing from an early age. I mean, I didn't think of it in these terms at that time, but that was clearly sort of the path leading to being a record producer. I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm going to be a record producer. I was still thinking like, how am I going to pay my rent? And, I'm going to play guitar. I better play guitar better. But so that's kind of it. So Billy moved to LA. So the gigs ended. I moved to Manhattan and like really lucky, like really within a relatively short space of time, I started freelancing. I fell in with lots of different groups of musicians. I mean, New York's amazing that way. There's so much music and there's so many different kinds of musicians. And in order to work, you really have to honor and have the discipline to learn a lot of stuff. Like you kind of have to have at least a rudimentary ability to like navigate standards, because you could play if you knew standards, right? So you had to kind of like, I had to grok jazz harmony, and the country scene was starting. It was kind of the urban cowboy period. So there was lots of country bars, and I fell into a scene that did that. And so my love of Burton and all that had to come out. So I had to learn how to do that. Singer-songwriter thing was happening. So there was a lot of different things. And I fell into this one group of musicians, which is pretty extraordinary. I would have never, if you would have told me at the time what would have happened to everybody, I would have just thought, oh, you're high. Yeah. But the first night I met Shawn Colvin, she was singing backup in Buddy Miller's band.
Okay.
Like, they all lived in Bright. And I had already become friends with Jim Lauderdale, and Larry Campbell was playing in Buddy Miller's band. Tony Garnier, who's been playing bass with Bob Dylan for like 30 years. So that was one of my little soul groups of players. I had some other sort of more contemporary pop-oriented things that I was doing at the same time. I think maybe one thing that's unusual about me. It's like I fell into like some people just sort of stayed in their little like rootsy world, which although nobody called it a rootsy world back then. Then there was kind of a folk world. There was kind of like a full-on pop world. There was an R&B world. You had to have that together too. But so I met Colvin, and I think I had the balls to go up to her and say, God, you're great. We should write songs together. And the thought had never crossed her mind to write her own songs. She was doing covers. She tried it, and we clicked. We just started writing these songs, and it took a while. Eventually, I got a home recording set up, and it wasn't like I was trying to be a record producer, but I produced her demos, and she got signed to Columbia, and they were like, well, who did the demos? And it's like, this guy over here. All right, you produce it. I was like, boom, I'm a record producer. And I won a Grammy, and all of a sudden, I'm a record producer. And then in a relatively short period of time, I produced or co-produced with Rodney Crowell, Lauderdale's first album. He actually did a record for Warner Brothers, and Jim and I wrote all the tunes. So this all happened in like a 12-month period.
Yeah, it was Planet of Love.
Yeah, Planet of Love. So those two records sort of came out at the same time, and Shawn's did really well. Jim's didn't sell, but a lot of the tunes got covered, right?
Yeah.
And so it opened up a lot of worlds for me, right? Met my current wife, and
yeah. Let's back up a little bit. You just kind of...
Yeah, it was a lot. It's a New York thing. What can I tell you? Right.
So, first off, how did you start writing songs? I mean, what made you want to... Was it the Beatles?
Yeah, I think the template has to be, at least the spark is the Beatles. And I think my early attempts have a Beatle imprint on it. And this will lead to another conversation about how you use your influences or abuse your influences. So I think a lot of what I've tried to do is honor and use my influences, but not have them show up as a pastiche of cliches in what I do. I've tried really hard to find original ways of taking all these things that I love. I don't know, man. it's like, why are you a guitar? It's like, why are you a guitar player? It's like,
Right.
it's just, I felt compelled to write songs in the
Okay.
same way I felt compelled to be a musician. It just was in me. It's in some people. It's not in other people.
And writing with Shawn, you know, she had not written before that?
I think she had dabbled a little bit. She had written a couple of tunes, but I don't think she had really embraced it in the way, you know, it's not dissimilar from playing. So if you're going to really embrace playing, at some point, you kind of make this thrust to being committed to it and learning about it and putting time into it, even if you're not doing it in like a classically disciplined way of like, I'm going to sit here for 4 hours, and you're still thinking about it. You're thinking guitar, you're thinking music, you're wondering, you're like messing around. Songwriting's the same way. I don't think she had really put energy into it and I already had a band which I was writing the tunes in, like a pop band. But I wasn't that happy with it. Literally, I knew Colvin was great the first night I heard her. And so I just had this intuitive sense we would make a good collaborative team. And it turned out, it didn't happen like that. We wrote a bunch of bad songs too, obviously. But after a couple of years, through some give and take and her finding her voice as a player, and we were able to sort of find things. It was basically me writing the music and her writing the lyrics, although there are areas where it overlapped. And we were very conscious of wanting to do something that wasn't being done. Or let me say this a better way. We just didn't want to we didn't want to make, it was the 80s were a dark period for rootsy music, let's face it. The kind of roots revolution didn't really start until the 90s. And the 80s, it was still sort of the tyranny of the mammoth backbeat and a lot of synth stuff. And record companies were only interested in hits, and not that they're not interested in hits now, but you know what I mean. It's sort of like, what are you going to do with some eccentric, weird folk record or folk whatever? I don't know what that first record is. People called it a folk record. I never thought about that, because the truth of the matter is, I love pop music too. How could you love the Beatles and not love pop music? I appreciate and honor and respect the tradition of trying to come up with a hit. Now, do I spend my heart and soul trying to figure out how to have a hit? No. But it's part, in the same way that all these other things are part of me, it's just part of me. I love the tradition of having a hit. When Colvin and I had Sonny came home on the radio, I was like, this is awesome. It's like, we have a hit. We finally got a real hit.
Yeah.
So we love pop music too, but we weren't trying to write hits or anything. It was just all mixed up in what we were doing.
So in kind of the craft side of things, you kind of tended to come up with music, and then she would write lyrics to
For
that?
the most part, with a bunch of people I collaborate with, it kind of divides that way. But with other people, like with Jim and I, when we were writing, we haven't actually written in a while, we would do both of us would do both. Like William Bell, I would write lyrics too. It just depends on the project. Like certain, I've been fortunate enough, like my wife, it's like, I'm just completely flabbergasted by how great a lyricist she is. She's just like, so why would there's no way I'm going to write lyrics with Rosanne, because it doesn't get any better. I'm just really lucky. And she has a real point of view as a lyricist. So when she writes songs, particularly for herself, that's what her spirit, that's what she's bringing to it. And the same with people like Colvin and who else, like Marc Cohn or any of those people. They have a strong lyrical point of view.
Okay. Well, let's move. So again, with Steady On, you won a Grammy. All of a sudden, you're a Grammy award-winning producer. So
exciting,
so then you were
where's my Porsche?
Where's my Porsche? so then I guess the next kind of stop is Jim Lauderdale.
It's all pretty much right in there.
Okay.
Yeah. So Jim and I had been buddies for almost a decade at that point. Like I told you, like I met Jim, and Larry Campbell and I were really good friends, still really good friends, and Jim. And there was like kind of this scene, this kind of, do you remember the whole urban cowboy thing?
Yes.
Yeah, so there was like this 7 or 8 year period in New York where there were all these bars and clubs, like the Lone Star, City Limits, Crystal Palace, all these places where you could play and gig, right? Make $100 a night, right?
Yeah.
So we were all in dozens of bands, So there were lots of singers, and we were all getting hired. Larry and I can't tell you how many gazillions of gigs I did with Larry and me, both playing guitar, and we played with Jim, and Tony was the bass player, and it was kind of endless in a lot of ways. And Lauderdale and I, at some point, I probably just turned to him too and said, man, we should write songs. And we did. And we both really liked what we were doing. And we didn't know what it was because it wasn't particularly commercial country, but it wasn't like all that uncommercial. I mean, I don't know, man. We didn't know what we were doing. We were mavericks. And then by some fluke, Rodney heard this demo tape that Jim and I made.
Okay.
And he's like, who's this guy?
Yeah.
I said, oh, this guy, Jim Lauderdale in New York. Well, what? Well, get him a deal. So Rodney got Jim a deal on Warner Brothers. And Rodney was going to produce it. But he's like, well, it was the same exact thing. Who's the guy who did the demos? This guy Leventhal. Well, let's get him in. So that was really it.
Now, is that where you met Rosanne?
That's where I met Rosanne. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We won't talk about the rest of that, but no, we can't. No, it's all cool. It's totally cool. Yeah. I met Rosanne, and then I produced a record on Rodney, as you all say down here.
Okay.
Making a record on Joey.
Yeah.
In New York, we say we're making a record with. Down here, you make a record on. I'm not sure why that is. Prepositionally different.
It's taking advantage of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember the first time I think Tony Brown was the first person I said, I'm making a record on. And I was like, what? What do you mean you're making a record with? Then I made a record with Rodney somewhere in there, and I made a
Life is Messy.
Yeah, Life is Messy. Made a record with Marc Cohn. It was a busy though. Like 89 to like 93 was a pretty busy period for me.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And kind of hitting back on Jim Lauderdale.
Sure.
You kind of touched on the fact that the album was not really a commercial success,
no.
But now I'm one of the few people that went out and bought the record at Tower Records when I was in college, and I bought it because I saw Jim
naked on the cover. All right, Zach. I always felt like that's what destroyed it. They made him take his shirt off. I was like, no, don't do that.
I saw him on television. He was on the American Music Shop, and it was with Marc O'Connor and a bunch of heavy players, and they were performing songs off the album. And from that, I went out and found the album, and I didn't really hear anything from it until all of a sudden, the George Strait movie came out.
Right. Yeah, that was great for us.
And all of a sudden, there were a number of those songs. And it was almost like the album that you made was almost like an expensive songwriter demo.
It's exactly what it was. Yeah, George Strait cut a couple of those tunes. Lord, thank you. I've never actually met him, but, I say this semi-facetiously, but in a way, those two tunes put the down payment on my house.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
So it was King of Broken Hearts?
No, he may have done King of Broken Hearts. Jim, that's the one song Jim wrote by himself. He did Sidewalk Ends, and he did this song, wasn't a hit. Oh my God. I wasn't fooling around, I think it's called. Yeah. Oh my God, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the other song. He cut two songs that Jim and I wrote. Okay. And then put one of them on his greatest hits, and it sold like 5 million records.
It was also in the box set. Straight out of the box.
Yeah. God bless George Strait. God bless George Strait.
And you've never met him?
I have not met him. No.
Okay.
Well, I have kind of a weird schizophrenic career where I've had this slight little inroad into country in Nashville, but I live in New York, and most of what I do isn't really about the Nashville thing. I've maybe now a little more with the advent of Americana, that part of Nashville. Mm-hmm. It's hard to figure.
So kind of continuing chronologically, so you get, again, I guess another one of your friends in New York is Marc Cohn.
Sure.
And then, he has Walking in Memphis,
Massive.
Which is a huge hit.
Yeah.
And you worked on that record also.
I did. Well, this was all, I can't keep the timeline straight. It was an exciting few years. That was actually maybe even before, is that, Mark, did it come out in 90 or 91? I can't remember. Mark, once again, this is going to sound funny. I hadn't thought of this. Mark, apparently there was these demos I made with Colvin in which I had either played percussion or sort of programmed some drums in a slightly quirky way, or perhaps that wasn't being done maybe. Okay. Like it wasn't about the or anything. I I was kind of early on. I was taking the EQ and rolling some of the high end off of these little drum machiney things, but I would play shakers on top of them and, clap and use a compressor to like make the clap sound like a cool backbeat. This is early on in my little home studio. So I had this like 5 or 6 song demo that got Colvin signed, and that got passed around apparently. And Marc heard that, and he had been cutting his first album and actually cut an entire album using drummers and was ultimately unhappy with it. And he heard that, he said, "That's what I want." "Who's that?" "And it's John Leventhal." So he hired me not to play guitar. He didn't know me. He didn't know what I did. He thought I was a drummer percussionist.
Okay.
So he hired me to come in and do drumming and percussion and programming on this first record. And I said, "Yeah, it's cool." But, I said, "I play guitar and bass too." And he said, "Okay, well, bring guitars and bass." And I took over. So I ended up arranging and playing guitar, Hammond, and bass on Walking in Memphis. And then I produced Marc's next record. So I helped arrange his first record. But it was exciting because that was another song that was on the radio all the time. It was nice to hear yourself on the radio all the time.
Yeah.
Those days so long ago.
And then you ended up producing Rosanne. So how did she end up contacting you to produce her record?
Well, I met her through, Jim and I met Rose. We met when I came down to do Jim's record. I met Rose, and that was that. And then I did a record on Rodney not too long after that. Without getting too much into our personal story, which is really not all that juicy. I mean, Rosanne's and Rodney got divorced, and she really wanted to move to New York. And she contacted me, and we sort of hit it off as a couple. And she asked me to produce this album, The Wheel. She was transitioning out of her commercial country phase, because she had made a really lovely record called Interiors. And it didn't really do anything. And I think she felt basically, we could get into a more in-depth discussion of the music community here or anywhere, but basically they didn't care about it at all. There weren't any hits on it, and so they weren't interested in that what we now call singer-songwriter, sort of the beginning of the singer-songwriter thing.
Right before that, she had King's Record Shop, which had been a huge record.
Yeah. Had like 4 or 5 #1 records, or 4 or 5 top 10 records.
And the record label wanted another one.
And it was a good record, and she that's my wife. She can be a bit of a contrarian, but she's ever thrusting, ever looking for new stuff. I mean, it's hard not to love her for it. And she threw something away, and I'm sure a lot of people in the business here thought she was probably crazy, And maybe she was, but she was crazy in a beautiful way. So she moved to New York. We made this record, The Wheel. It's a complicated record for me. I don't like my production from that period. It's really hard for me to go back and listen to my early records. I don't like what I was doing at all. It's too much. Okay. I think I was just trying to do too much and trying to get too much in there. I hadn't fully embraced or understood how to really do a whole lot less, but have it mean a whole lot more. It's something you just got to learn. I mean, I've been doing it 30 years now, so I like to think I'm starting to learn it now. So a lot of those early records where I feel like I'm flexing I'm throwing in the kitchen sink on everything. It's like, oh God, stop. I mean, I think there are a couple of good songs we wrote on there. Lord knows she wrote some beautiful songs. And the record was really critically well received, but not, like Interiors, not particularly commercially successful. But that's how I got to that.
There was, probably the first cut, The Wheel, had Stewart Smith.
Awesome. Well, what can you say about Stewart? He's such a, he's my kind of musician. He's got all you need to play great guitar, but he doesn't let the guitar dictate what the statement's supposed to be. So he's also deeply musical, and that's my kind of musician.
It seems like the two of you've kind of worked with a lot of the, some of the same artists, and sometimes you've cut the record, and then he's toured with them. And
yeah, it's true with Shawn. Yeah, he's gone out. Yeah, he's definitely had to go out and play my bits on a lot of Shawn stuff. Yeah.
And then he was playing with Rosanne before.
Yeah, that's where I met Stewart, and that's where I heard that guitar part. Like, we were going to do the record, and she was like, "Well, I've been playing it with Stewart." I said, "Oh, yeah, let me hear it." And I heard it. I was like, "Oh my God!" For about a half a nanosecond, I thought like, "Well, maybe I could." No, let's get Stewart. Right?
So is there a delay on that, or is that just him finger picking?
It's I did actually work it out once because I was like, "Okay, I'm going to do this," and I think it's like banjo roll number 1, basically.
Okay.
It's I'm not going to embarrass myself for listening or viewing public, but it's basically. I think it's just standard banjo roll over D add 9,
Okay.
So, and I think I may have put a little delay on there too.
It's so clean and ringing out perfectly.
Well, Stewart plays with thumb and finger pick, so he has a super clean sound. I mean, cleaner than I play with these. I can't play with thumbs and finger picks, but he has that sound going on, and he likes a bunch of compression, but it was perfect for that record. Yeah.
Very cool.
And Stewart understands parts and the purpose of parts, and the parts are supposed to be in there to enhance everything. And if you're going to play a part, make it mean something so you can have it speak and stuff.
Let's take a quick break, and
Sure.
then we'll come right back and we'll talk more about production and
Cool.
also talk about guitars.
Sounds good.